Today's daf we're going to be learning is Gittin, daf Kafzayin. Pretty simple, straightforward daf for today. We're going to start a topic about what if I find, let's say I'm a messenger and I'm bringing a get to be delivered, and then it gets lost, and then I find it. Now the question is, if we have this whole issue of lishma, and the get has to be written for this man, for this woman, just like we kind of had that case where he threw her something, we weren't sure what he threw, and then we found the mezuzah. And can we assume that it was the mezuzah that he threw and not the get? Same thing here. If I find a get with the exact same names as the people who I was supposed to be sending the get to, with the same city, can I assume it's them? Or do I have to be concerned that maybe somehow, coincidentally, there happens to be what I found is actually the get of somebody else. It happens to have the same name and the same, right, and all that. So this structure is going to be pretty clear. We're going to have a halacha in the Mishna. Then Raba is going to bring a contradiction, or the Gemara is going to bring a contradiction between this and the Mishna and Bava Metzia. Then Raba is going to resolve the contradiction. Then Rabbi Zeira, and then the Gemara is going to go off on an aside and add another element based on a story that happened with Raba. That's going to say, well, he must also say this based on this story, and that's going to be Raba's response, and which is going to be two-pronged. One that he actually said, and then in addition that the Gemara is going to say based on some story that happened. And then we're going to have Rabbi Zeira, who's going to bring the same type of contradiction, but not from a Mishna and Bava Metzia, but from a braita. And then we're going to resolve it in the exact same way that Raba resolves it, at least part one of Raba. We're going to debate whether part two of Raba is also true for Rabbi Zeira, or he actually disagrees with that point. And then we're going to say, why didn't he explain like him and he explained like him? And that's going to get us mostly through the daf. So that's kind of the intro to the first part of our daf. So the big issue here, obviously, is again, if you lose it, what did you find? Okay, and this isn't just true for get, this could be true for other things, because even if it's not lishma, okay, maybe it's someone else's get, right? You can't give a get that was someone else's to this person, and maybe when it's, let's say it's a promissory note, okay? Now, the issue is also, right, we're going to start with someone who's a messenger on his way to bring the get, but then we're going to get to these cases when we quote the Mishna and the braita, about someone who just randomly finds a document on the ground. Can we assume, if you're a borrower and you borrow money from someone, so generally what happens is you write a document, you give it to the lender, and the lender keeps the document until you pay back the loan. So if I find an IOU, can I assume it was lost from the lender? Or do I return it to the borrower? Now that's also going to be a question. Who lost it? And if we're not sure who lost it, is it a problem to return it? Because if we return it to the one who loaned, if we return it to the one who loaned the money, then he can now claim, oh, you owe me money. But what if it was already returned? Right now, there's certain assumptions usually we make, which is once it's returned, usually we tear it up. But maybe it was never given. Maybe they never gave the loan. Maybe they were preparing to give the loan, but wrote up the document and then it never happened. So it's a very big issue. If you return the document, let's say to the loaner, the lender, he's going to now try to get money back from the borrower, and maybe it's not his to do. With the get, maybe, right? There's all sorts of monetary issues. If she is with the get, it's complicated because of monetary issues, and there's isur v'heter issues, right? So if we assume we find a get that's lost, we give it back to him, well, then she's not divorced, right? Or he could claim she's divorced and already paid her back her ketubah money, and that's why she gave it the get. Because the get could theoretically be used by her to collect her ketubah money. If she doesn't have a ketubah, she could say, oh, here's my get. Look, you divorced me and I didn't get my money yet. So there's all sorts of, again, either she could try to get married using it, or she could also try to get money out of him using it. So it's very tricky to return this document when we're not sure who actually lost it. So again, we're going to start our case with a messenger. Maybe get avad himen. So somebody brings a get and it gets lost. Mitza'ola altil kashel. Basically, the Mishnah rules, very simple ruling. If he finds it immediately, of course, they don't define what immediately is. We'll have to wait till the end of the daf to see several different explanations for what immediate is. But if he finds it immediately, kasher, then it's good. Vim lav, but if not, pasul, because again, we're worried maybe he found someone else's get. However, they give a few other examples where it actually could be returned. He could really use it. And then again, use it means he's now going to continue. He was on his way to deliver the get to the woman. In this case, it's not like the other cases where I told you we just found it and we don't know whose it was and was she divorced or not. In this case, it's very clear that it was the messenger's and he's on his way to deliver the get, can he deliver with this get? Or does he have to worry, maybe this is not actually the get? If he finds it in, his JanSport knapsack, or something where it was clear where he put it in there and now he's delivering it, then it's fine, right? This is classic where, my kids lose things and then it turns out it was like in some little bag, some little compartment in some bag that they forgot to look at. So if he couldn't find it and all of a sudden he found it in his bag or in some utensil that some place where he specifically put it, not location, but in something, okay, well, then, or in mikiro, or, which we'll get to later in the Gemara, if he recognizes it, he knows that there was some very clear identifying mark on this particular get, and he can identify it and say, oh, I know this is the get that I had. Then kasher. Rashi says this is the imikiro, not imikiro. It's not connected to the chafisa or the duluskama, but it's saying either in this chafisa, in this duluskama, or if he recognizes it. Okay, so these are all exceptions to the rule. But the general rule is it has to be found immediately. If it's not found immediately, or it doesn't have identifying marks, or in an identified place where he knew exactly, it was, again, not like location, but in some container, then we know he can use it. But other than that, it doesn't work. Urimin comes the contradiction from a Mishna Bava Metzia. Matzah Gittin nashim. This is the case where someone just randomly finds a get on the ground, okay, or somewhere, we don't know where, but finds a get of a woman. Shiur avadim, an emancipation document of a slave. Daitike, wills of people, like a will of somebody. Matanot, gifts, okay, saying, I gifted you this plot of land, which again, if it's in my hands, that means I haven't given it to you yet. If it's in your hands, then it's yours. So that would be a huge ramification of who's the owner of this field right now. Shovarim, which is the receipt that you get for having paid back a loan, let's say, or if we have it before, the husband could write his own shoval, right, for the woman giving back, he paid the woman her tuba money. So if there's a shovar that says, I paid my wife back the tuba money, again, can we assume it was lost from him and give it back to him? Well, it says here, Harez lo yachzil. You can't return this. Why can't you return it? Shani omer, ktuvim hayuv nimlach alehem shalom nitnan. It could be they wrote these up and then they never gave them. Could be there was a loan and they just never took the loan. They were getting ready. I was going to loan you the money, and then something happened. I didn't have the money. I didn't give you the money, and now there was no loan. Okay, we don't know. We have no idea. Did the divorce happen? Did it not? It's a divorce document. Does that mean? Okay, so we don't give it back to anybody. But what do they infer from this Mishnah? Well, notice what it didn't say. The whole question here is, we don't know, did he give her the get? Did he not give her the get? Was there a loan? Was there not a loan? Did he free the slave? Did he not free the slave? However, if we know, which would mean what? Ha'amar tnu. If the husband says, oh yeah, that's the get that was on the way to my wife. Can you give it to her? Notznim. We give it to her. Now, notice now this is just an inference, okay? That would be very clear about this. They're inferring because the only issue is maybe it was never given and maybe the husband decided never to give the get. Let's just take the get as an example. If he says give the get, or it was a promissory note and I borrowed money from you and I said, oh, you found our promissory note. Yeah, give it back to you. Then notznim, afilu lizman merubah. Even if a lot of time passes and we're not worried, we're not worried that maybe it was someone else's promissory note and they happen to have the same names as us. Or we're not worried that maybe it was someone else's get and not our get. So basically, you see here, again, it doesn't, and remember this, doesn't it say this explicitly in this Mishnah, but you can infer from our Mishnah that if he were to say, give it to her, they would give it to her. And even if a lot of time passed because it didn't say not, in other words, again, it didn't say, but it didn't relate to it at all. So how do we relate to this? Because again, our Mishnah said, if time passes, it's an issue. This says, if time passes, it's not an issue. I'm a Raba lo kasha. Don't worry, this is not a problem. If It depends how populated a place is. If there's caravans that go to that area and then a lot of people come, then you're worried it's someone else's document. But if there aren't a lot of caravans that pass by here, then we're not worried it's someone else's. We can assume it's yours. And that's a simple explanation. But now the Gemara gets a little bit more detail and said, wait, you missed an important point. Even if there are a lot of caravans that pass by there, it only is going to be a problem, meaning you can return it otherwise. You can assume it's our get, and say, or our document. It's only if there's other people with the same names as us in the city. If we live in a city, this shows how little they travel, right? I mean, they did travel in those days, but there's less of a chance that someone else's get from some other city is going to end up in our city. So we look at the population list in our city and we see all the names. And if we see that there's no one who's, here they say, right, there's Yosef ben Shimon, there's no one named Yosef ben Shimon in the city. If it was a get, by the way, you would need two people with those names. So now we're going to assume if there aren't two people in that city, then it's not an issue. You don't have to worry. They don't seem to be worried, even though caravans come, that it's people from other cities. It could be if it's like a city where the shuk was and it served, the population of a few little cities, then it could be, or a few little villages, I would say. Could be we mean all the villages around. But basically, if they're not clear where the borders of the city go, just like they're not clear what immediately is, right? Not everything is spelled out here, but the concepts are spelled out, which is, if there really aren't two people with that name, then obviously we're not really concerned that it's someone else's document, and therefore you don't have to worry. Okay, so basically, we now say, our Mishna says it's a problem if time passed, and you would need caravans to be coming by, and people with the same name. If there aren't caravans, and there are two people with the same name, we're not worried either, because we're assuming nobody really comes to this area. And even though there's someone else with that same name, we're not worried that it somehow got here. Okay, so you would need those two criteria, and two people with the same name, in order to make it an issue. Now, why is this? Why do we assume that this is what Raba says? Why do we assume Raba said this? He didn't say this. He just said, Shiur and Shiur. Why do you have to add this thing about the two people? You would have to have two people with the same name for it to be an issue. Well, if you don't say that that's what Raba said, we have a contradiction of what Raba said somewhere else. And now we're going to have a story or a situation that happened. A get came in front of the Beit Din of Rav Huna. There was a lost get that was found. And it said this happened in the city Shvire, which is on the Rachis, I assume means on the banks of the river. Ve'amar Rav Huna, Rav Huna says, maybe there's two cities called Shvire that are on the Rachis is the name of the Nahar. Okay, on the river Rachis. Maybe there's two cities named Shvire on the river Rachis. It's a little bit strange that he would suggest this, but he says perhaps it's not the people we're talking about, because maybe it's referring to a different city. Now, Rav Huna said this in his Beit Din. Rav Chisda said to Raba, Puk va'yenba, go look into this issue more seriously. Because in the evening, Rav Huna is going to ask you about this. Okay, not sure why, but he assumes Rav Huna is going to come ask him. So Raba looks into it. Nafik daf be'eshkach. He goes, he looks into it, and he finds Ditnan that there's a Mishna. It's strange that Rav Huna didn't see this Mishna. So a lot of questions you can ask about this story, but we'll just read the story of the Mishna. If it was done in a court, the assumption is this get was done in a court, it had the signatures of the witnesses, and maybe it was verified somehow in a court, but something that came out of a court, now remember what our concern was in the Mishna, in Bava Metzia. What was the concern? That maybe they never went through with it, right? Maybe I was going to lend you money and I ended up strapped for money, and I didn't have my own money, I couldn't lend you money. Okay, something happened, I don't know. So, or maybe the husband decided not to divorce the wife in the end. He got the document ready, decided not to divorce her. Well, if it was done in a court, obviously they went through with it, and then you can return it. Now, it seems a little weird though, but this happened in the area of the court of Rav Huna. And by the court of Rav Huna, there's a lot of caravans that go by, which would mean, again, maybe the fact that it's a maaseh beitin proves one issue, which is we know that the action took place, but who's to say that this isn't someone else's document who also did the same thing, right? V'kapashit yachzir, and yet what did Raba said? We return it. Okay, he basically said we don't worry. Like the concern that there's two cities by the name of Shvire that are on the Nahar called Rachis is a very rare situation, right? Very unlikely. That we're not worried about. But maybe, right, we still have to worry that maybe there's two people with the same name, and that's an issue that maybe this isn't their document. So what if it was stamped by the court? Doesn't make a difference. It could be someone else's document that was stamped by the court. So therefore, we have to assume that since he said we return this document, it must be he wasn't worried about two people with the same name because it must be, I'll just say it and then I'll read it in the words of the Gemara, that there weren't two people with that same name in the city. And therefore, only if we know that there's two people by the same name in the city are we concerned about it. Otherwise, we let it go. And that's why he said this document can be returned because number one, it was verified by the court. So it definitely happened. And that resolves issue number one, that maybe he never went through with it. Number two, or maybe the deal never went through. Number two, we're not worried it's somebody else because there happens to be nobody else. So they assume from this story that Raba must hold. Again, this is all assumptions they're making, but maybe logical assumptions. That it must be that as long as there aren't two people with the same name, that issue is not a concern. Avid Raba uvda ba'hu gita, de'eshtakach be'kitana b'pupadita kishamate. Now we see that he actually acted upon his opinion, which is always stronger if you actually act upon it. In a case of a get that was found by the flax, we're going to have to figure out by what about the flax was found and what exactly was the scenario. In pupadita, and he ruled with his ruling basically allowing something to be returned based on the circumstances. Now, there's a debate about what were the circumstances. So Ikad Amr, some people say, it was where they were soaking the flax. Now, the place where you soak the flax is not a very populated place. So the issue is, why did he allow it to be returned? Because Ein Shayarot Mitzuyat, right? Af Agav Dehuchziku. Even though maybe there were two people with that exact same name, but it doesn't matter. Because even if there were two people with the same name, if it was close to the area this person was, right, and there was nobody else around, it's not a place that was very populated, because there weren't caravans. So therefore, we allowed this person to get his get back. The ikadamre or whatever it was. Right? It says Gita. Gita, by the way, could be a get. It also could be a regular document. We've seen that other documents are called gets. But either which way, right? Let's say it's assumed it's a get. He was allowed to get his get to then, go bring it. Maybe it was a messenger who lost the get also. It could be. Or it could be the husband. And we assume he hadn't given it yet and he can now give it. And we don't worry that it got confused with someone else's. Ikad Amre, some people say, it was a place where they sold the flax. Okay, they sold, maybe it was already linen at this point. But anyway, they sold it, which means it's a populated place. So it's a case again where there are caravans, but it must have been a case where there was only one person with that name in the city, or if it's a get, right, one person with that name who's married to one person with that name. And therefore, there's only one couple in the city with those names, and therefore they were able to return it. Okay, so very simply, what we saw in Amud Aleph, or almost at the end of Amud Aleph, what we saw so far was we have a Mishna that talks about a messenger who lost the get. Can he, when he finds it, use it? If either found it immediately, and then we know it wasn't switched with a different one, or he found it specifically in the place, wrapped in a way or something where he had left it, or he recognized it by some unique signs. Then we brought a contradiction to this with a random get, not a messenger necessarily, but we find a get on the street. Can we go say, oh, look, his name, her name, let's go return it to, right, probably the woman, she probably received it already, or promissory notes or all those things, gifts, etc. Can we assume that? And they say, no, you cannot, right? And why is that? Because maybe they never wanted to give it, right? Unless, and then we assumed from there, unless they do say, give it, right? It really, I've given this to this person already. And then it seems like you could, even if time passed. And why aren't we worried that maybe it's someone else's? And then we distinguish between Raba said, Shiur and Shiur when there's a lot of caravans, that's our Mishna, and that's why only immediately. When there's no caravans, we don't have to worry about it. And then we said, based on the story of Raba and where he tried to rule it, or he said against Rav Huna's ruling, basically said you can return it. We're going to have to assume that it must have been a place, even though there were Shiurot, there were a lot of people and caravans going by, we still weren't worried because it must be a case where we don't have two people with that same name. So he has, in order to not return it, it has to be, number one, a very populated area. Number two, that there are two people in that city with the same name. You don't have to go so far as to say maybe it's someone's from a different city that got here also. That's already too far. Now Rabbi Zeira comes with his contradiction, which is going to be very similar. Rabbi Zeira Rami Matnitin braita umishani. He brought the Mishna, a contradiction between our Mishna and a braita, not the Mishna Bava Metzia, but a braita. And he said the following. So first he quotes our Mishna. Maybe get va'avadi menu, you bring a get, it gets lost. If you find it immediately, it's good. If not, it's disqualified. Uriminu, and this contradicts the following braita. Matzah get isha bashuk. Again, this is more similar to the Mishna Bava Metzia. You find a get of a woman in the shuk. Bizman shabal modeh yachzir laisha. If the husband says yes, we're divorced, then you give it back to the woman and she can keep the get. Okay, and he agrees that you can give it back to her. And habal modeh, but if he doesn't agree, doesn't admit that he gave it to her already and that it's hers, lo yachzir lo lezeh v'lo lezeh. He doesn't get it and she doesn't get it. Nobody gets it. He doesn't get it because, again, and this is Rashi says what I talked about before, which is if you look at lo lezeh v'lo lezeh, about 5 lines from the end of Rashi on the page of the last Rashi, leba lo yachzir shema kvar nitanola umimena nafal. Don't give it back to the man because maybe it's the woman's and it fell from her. If it gets to his hands, what will he claim? He'll find Eidim Mesira via Idu Shiur Sham. He'll say, listen, we were divorced. Here are the Eidim that can prove they watched the divorce take place. And then he'll say, but the get's in my hands. What does that show? He'll say, well, why is the get in my hands? Because I already paid you the ketubah money, and that's why you gave me the get. Because the get can be used. It's not really a promissory note, but it can somewhat be used as it. Because again, if she doesn't have a ketubah, right? So we're going to see right now, Utsnan, the Mishnah says, Hotziad get, ve'eni mo ketubah, gova ketubata. If she pulls out the get, she can use it in court to get a ketubah money if she doesn't have a ketubah. She could say, here's my get, and you haven't given me the ketubah money. So if it's in his hands, he could claim, oh, I already paid you back the ketubah. And that's why you can't claim anything on me in court. So that's why we don't return it to him, because we don't know if it's his or not. Right? So then he can keep going and say, and they made me pay. The reason they gave the get to me in his saga is, right? Oh, have the get in my hand because they gave it to me because I already paid, and that's my proof that I paid. And we don't give it back to the woman. Shematina Sebo. Maybe she'll use it to get married, and maybe she's really not divorced. Okay. Anyway, we've gotten this already. This is kind of the things we discussed. So we see we can't return it. But what does it say here? If the Baal is modeh, now this didn't say so in the previous case. Remember, in the previous case, and this is why I want to just distinguish between the Mishnah and the braita, the conclusion is the same that comes out of both of them. But in the Mishnah, all it said was we don't return them because maybe they changed their minds and they never actually used this. Okay. And it didn't say anything about if one side admits that they actually gave it to the other one, we'll let it, right? We'll allow them to return it. But we just assumed that's what it meant. And then we made another jump, which is not just if the person admits it, but even if time elapses, right? So we kind of had to make 2 jumps. In this source, it said more explicitly because it says, Bizman shabal modeh yachzir laisha. And it doesn't, number one, say anything about time passing. It just seems to say very clearly, it's all up to the husband. If he says it's her get, then we give it to her. It doesn't matter that 3 months passed from the time it got lost or whatever it is. So here we say, turning now to Amabet, Bizman shabal modeh miat yachzir laisha. That seems very clear from the braita. It says it, right? When the husband admits to it, then we give it back to the woman. And since it didn't say anything about a time factor, afilu l'zman merubah, seems pretty clear, even if time passes. So this is more clear than it was in the Mishnah. The Mishnah in Bava Metzia, it was kind of clear, but it wasn't as clear as here. So basically, it's bringing the exact same contradiction, which is, since it doesn't say anything about the time, and it seems to allow for returning, right? This one more clearly than the Mishnah. Mishnah, we inferred it from there. But okay, so you can return it even after time elapses. And our Mishnah said not. So he's going to answer it the exact same way that Raba answered, which is umashane kam b'makom shashayirot mitziot kam b'makom she'ena shayirot mitziot. Again, how do we resolve this contradiction? The Mishnah says only immediately. The braita says even after time. Again, the braita didn't say, but it's pretty clear the braita allows even if time elapses. Very simply, when we allow even if time elapses, it's a case where nobody really passes by there, and therefore we're not concerned that it got mixed up with somebody else's. In the Mishnah, where they said only immediately, is a public place where there's caravans going by, and it's very, or at least possibly likely, that it's somebody else's document. And that's how we resolve it, exactly how we resolved it with Raba, except that if you remember, with Raba, we added that extra thing because of the story with Raba. With Raba, we said, you can even return it if there's shayarot mitzuyot in a case where there aren't two people with the same name in the town. But if you find two people with the same name, then it's a problem. So now the question is, what does Rabbi Zeira say about that? And as usual, we end up with two different approaches. Some people say, some people say that when he says you can't return it, because like in our Mishnah, unless it's immediate, that's only if there's two people with the same name in the town. But if you don't have two people with the same name in the town, you can return it, okay? Even if there's a lot of people, and that's exactly like Raba. But some people say, some people say, even if you don't know two people with that same name, you still can't return again, okay? And then we're going to have a different approach to what we just saw in Raba, which is Rabbi Zeira is strictly, are there shayarot, are there not shayarot? He doesn't start looking into, and this is maybe what Becky, you were asking before, what if someone from another city has the same name and then ended up here? If there's caravans going by, maybe it's someone from another town, and that might be what Rabbi Zeira is saying. Yeah, we do have to worry about that possibility. Again, it's a little bit similar to the way we started yesterday's talk about l'chashi baka, right? Well, do we have to worry that the flask is going to break and say, therefore, don't do this and live your life, worrying always about what all possibilities are? Or do we say, we'll deal with it when it happens, don't be such a worrier? So this could also be Rabbi Zeira saying, maybe we have to go even further to be concerned someone came from another town. And Rabbi is saying, no, we don't. But we don't really know what Rabbi Zeira says about this because he doesn't address it. And Raba didn't address it either, but it came up in some story with him, so we were able to infer from there what he thought. So we basically have these two rabbis. Again, to summarize, one brought the Mishna Bava Metzia and resolved the contradiction. The other brought a braita and resolved the contradiction. Same contradiction, really. Very similar sources, same response. Just Raba, we added this extra element from a story of his that you would need not only caravans to say you can't return it, but also two people with the same name in the town. Rabbi Zeira, we don't know what he holds on that issue, and that's our sugya. So before we move on, we're going to say the following. Why didn't Raba bring the contradiction from the braita, and why didn't Rabbi Zeira bring the contradiction from the Mishna? Okay, so that's how we're going to start here. It's very clear why Raba didn't bring the contradiction from the braita, because if you have a choice to bring a braita as a contradiction or a Mishna as a contradiction, Mishnas always have higher status. Because Rabbi Yehuda Nasi chose to put it in the Mishnah. The other stuff ended up just random sources that were floating around from the Tannaitic times. And Mishnayot are stronger. So it makes sense that Raba brought the Mishnah as a contradiction. Rabbi Zeira, my time alone, Raba. Why didn't Rabbi Zeira say like Raba? And I kind of already set this up before without telling you why I was doing it, but Amar Lacha, he could say, Mi katane imamar tnu notnim ba'afilu lizman meruba. It never says in that source, the whole thing about the Mishnah was all an inference. All the Mishnah said was, you can't, right? It said, let's just get the words exactly. It said, you can't return them, hareza lo yachzir, these shtarot that you find on the street, because it could be They wrote them v'nimlach alehem shalom nitzan and changed their mind about giving. From which they inferred two things, which is, well, if he says give, you can give it. And then that would seem even over a long period of time. But it never said any of those things. So because it wasn't so explicit, he didn't use that as a contradiction. And Mikatani, it doesn't say there, it doesn't say that if he said give it even after a while passed, which was the whole inference. It doesn't say that. It was all an inference. Dilma could be, the inference would be different. Maybe it would be, you can't return them unless the husband says, give the get to my wife, really it's hers, if you found it immediately, right? It could be, that would be the inference. So since it's not clear now, by the way, it's not clear in the braita also, just to be clear. It doesn't say, right? Oh, but it does say one more thing. It says, Bizman Shabal Modeh Yachzir Lishto. In the first case, that whole thing was inferred if the husband agrees. Here it says it explicitly, and again, you would say the following. If it was only immediate, you should have said immediate there. It would belong there. And the fact that it's missing seems to indicate that it's over a period of time. In the first Mishnah, the whole thing was missing. The whole thing was inferred. So you can't say, oh, they would have mentioned it. They didn't mention it because they didn't mention the whole halacha. So the whole situation of what if he agrees. So that's why Rabbi Zeira chose to pick the braita where the contradiction is much more apparent. Now, so that's our sugya so far. We have two contradictions, same type source, same type thing, just one is a little bit more inferred than the other. And we resolve it in the same way, perhaps one detail not the same, depending on what you say about, do you need to have two names in the city, the two people with the same name in order to say it's a problem or not? Now, we're going to have two other ways to resolve this contradiction. Rabbi Yirmia and Rav Ashi, and they're both going to do it with what's called inukimta, right? Now, even the first answer was inukimta because they're putting each one in a different scenario, right? One is where there's a lot of caravans and one is where there aren't a lot of caravans. By the way, I forgot to mention this, I just remembered. But the case, right, the Mishna, just to remember, the Mishna, which says immediate, is a place where there's a lot of people. The braita and the Mishna in Bava Metzia are not a lot of people, and that's why it seems to indicate you can return it, even after time passes. There's a little bit of a problem with that, because the braita says, one at the bottom of Kaf Zayin, you found the get of a woman in the shuk. Hard to say the shuk is a place that's not populated. So it's a little bit tricky there. I'm going to just leave that out. But this is a bit of a different type of ukimta. There it's like a general ukimta. Are there lots of people or are there not lots of people? Here we're going to get very particular in our ukimta. Ukimta again means we're going to take a Tanaitic source and say that it's only in a particular situation. They didn't give us all the details really. Rabbi Yirmia Amar, Kigon de Ka'amre Edim, Me'olam lo katamnu ela al get echad shel Yosef ben Shimon. The Mishnah and the Braita are talking about situations where the witnesses were there with us, who signed on the get, and they said, I only signed on one get in my life with the name Yosef ben Shimon in it. And that is this guy, Yosef ben Shimon, who's right in front of us. Doesn't say that, but Rashi says it must be that he's pointing to the guy, because you can see Rashi says, Kigon de ka'amrei edim achatumim bo, the ones who were signed, me'olam lo chatamnu ela al get echad shel shem zeh, v'oto chatamnu li'ish zeh hatov o. And where, like the guy who's claiming this is his get, that's the one. Okay, so if the edim come forward and say, this is the only get we've signed on, and this is the only, right, or with this name, and he's the guy, that's when we can return the get, even if 3 months passed since the get, was lost. To which the Gemara asks the obvious question, Rabbi Yirmia, why is it telling us this? Isn't that quite obvious? That if the witnesses come and say, these are our signatures, we signed on this get for this guy, and this is his, quite clear, what would be the question? Well, Mahu Detema, the Gemara answers, you might have thought, you might have thought, maybe there's another, let's say the witnesses are Yaakov and Avraham. And we have another Yaakov and Abraham also in the town, and maybe they're the ones who signed on this get for a different Yosef and Shimon and his wife Miriam. And, maybe we have to go that far as to say, well, it's very nice you're saying these are, first of all, they don't really get into, aren't they, recognizing their own signatures, and don't we assume people have unique signatures? But let's just put that aside. The fact that your names are on this document and the names of the couple who's in front of us who think it's their get are on this document perhaps you would think that maybe we have to worry. There was another Yosef and Shimon who was married to a Miriam who had Yaakov and Abraham sign on their get, and maybe it's theirs. Again, it's a little bit far-fetched to think that, but Kamash Malan that you don't. And that's why the braita is telling you don't need to worry about it. Rav Ashi Amal, Kigon de Ka'amal, Nekev Yesh Bo B'tzadot Plonid. And now we're going to get back to the issue of simanim. Ashi says, the case where we allow the husband, when the husband says, oh yeah, that's our get, and you can return it to my wife, we allow it, or the loan was our loan and you can return it to the lender. Well, that all works if they said there was a hole in this document right next to the letter Aleph in the line about whatever, okay? And you give a very, very specific siman. To have a siman muvhak. This is what we call a siman muvhak, a very clear sign. V'dafka b'tzad od ploni. Now notice Rav Ashi says in a very unique way that a siman muvhak. To have a siman muvhak. Aval nekev ba'alma le. But if you just say there was a hole in the get and you don't remember where it was, and therefore you can't identify it in this way, it doesn't work. Why? Misapkale, there was a debate about whether this, Rav Ashi wasn't sure where to hold on this issue, and this is an issue we're going to see when we get to Bava Metzia. Simanim ida oraita ida rabbanan. This is something we know about, probably you know about this. When we return lost items, right? This is not only in Jewish law, but in general, it's what makes Nizikin always so interesting, because it's something that the laws are very parallel to laws in any kind of society, which is, I find a ring on the floor and you say, oh, I lost my ring. And before I give it back to you, I'm going to ask you, what does the ring look like? Can you give me some, indicator, right? If it's a plain gold band, like my ring here, right? There's nothing identifiable about this. A lot of people have plain gold bands, it'd be hard for me to return it to you. I would need to, because you're not giving me any real siman. But if you give me a siman and say, oh, it had a little indentation right over there, then I would give it back. So now there's two categories of simanim. Okay, obviously there's a range, and where exactly in the range it falls out is a good question. Just like we don't know how much time passed, right? A lot of time, a little time, how many people, these are all very subjective, but there's some where it is pretty clear, either a lot of people, not a lot of people, or a noticeable sign or not, right? A very unique sign, right? So here we have it, a hole versus a hole next to a particular letter. So if you say just a hole, then it's not clear. Now, if you say, I lost my ring, and I say there's an indentation, okay, but I don't tell you where the indentation is. Now, lots of rings have indentations, so that would be a siman. Now, generally, we allow lost items to be returned based on a siman, and we don't require siman muvhak. The question is that a Torah law or a rabbinic law? If it's just a rabbinic law, then we could say when it comes to Dinei Mamonot, look, you just found it, and maybe it really is mine. I can get it back based on the rabbinic, right? First of all, the rabbis, Hefker Beit Din Hefker, they can decide money that's yours can be mine. They're able, they have the power to do that. But when it comes to saying, is this get belongs to the woman or not? That's an Eshet Ish issue. That's Isser V'Heter. If we're not sure if a siman is a siman, then right? If a siman is a deoraita law that we're going to say this is serious, or we're going to say it's just the rabbi said, let's just consider it significant. If it's just rabbinic, we won't allow it to allow this woman to get remarried based on this get, right? To get a get based on that. That's not strong enough. So because of that, he only allowed it if he said that braita, when it says we can return it to the woman, is only if they give very identifying marks, a siman muvhak. Okay, because of the regular siman, he's not sure is it to right or to Rabbanit. Now, this is a big machloket we're going to see in the second chapter of Bava Metzia, which is all about lost items, returning lost items. About this machloket. Are simanim to right or are they to Rabbanit? So here they say Rav Ashi, the fact that he said it has to be a siman muvhak, must be unclear whether siman is to right or to Rabbanit. Now we're going to have a story. Rabbi Bar Chana irkas legita b'bei midrash. He was a messenger. He had a get in hand, and he lost the get in the beit midrash. Amal isimana itle b'gavei itviyut ena itle b'gavei. Says, you want a siman? I can give you a siman. He says, you want a tviyut ayin? Tviyut ayin is some unique halacha, which is that we allow very general description, less than a siman, for a Talmud Chacham, because the assumption is, and one can question this assumption, especially nowadays, but that if someone's a Talmud Chacham, they must be trustworthy. So because we assume they're trustworthy, therefore, we basically allow it based on okay, so thanks, Ruth, you're telling me a better way to say it, visual recognition, okay, by just kind of say, oh yeah, that looks like mine, where you look at it and you say, oh yeah, that's mine. I know that that's the one I have, without much more than that, which is, that's already going much farther. So he said, number one, I could give you a siman. Number two, I could tell you by looking at it, I can tell you that's definitely mine. So now, Hadran, they gave it back to him. What's the problem? This wasn't really a controlled experiment because he had two things. So now, Amar lo yadana imishum simana adra because every simanim doraita. I don't know, did they return it to me because of simanim I gave? And if so, we can learn that simanim are doraita, right? Because if they allow me to get this back, this document back based on based on simanim, and they weren't simanim muvhakim, unique signs, then, right, maybe he just said there was some hole in it or something, then it's because simanim are Torah, by Torah law. And then anyone could get back a document based on just simanim. And imishum tviyat enev, it's because of visual recognition, dafka tzorva me'Rabbanan, aval inish ba'al malo. It would only work, because this halach only works for Talmidei Chachamim. So it would work only for Talmidei Chachamim, it wouldn't work for anybody else. Okay, so that we're left with, we don't really know, and because it wasn't a controlled experiment, because he gave two things, if he had just given one and seen what their reaction was, we would at least know about that. But instead he gave both all at once and wasn't sure why they ruled the way they did. Im lav pasul. Now we're back to the Mishna. We're finally going to get to what does it mean immediate. It says if it's not immediate, it's no good. Tanu Rabbanan. Now we're going to have a braita with several different opinions. Ezehu shalola alter. What is it considered not immediate? Rabbi Natan omer sheshahat kadesh tavor shayara b'tishre. It was enough time for a caravan to pass and wait there. And then obviously, right, that makes a lot of sense because it's the amount of time that relates to this particular issue of a shayara coming and somebody switching the gets or dropping their get, and the one we found was theirs. Rabbi Shimon ben Elazar omer kadesh yehei adam omed veroeh shelo aval sham adam. Now, this is two ways to understand this. Either so that a person will stand and see that nobody went, meaning this isn't a time issue. This is, you have to be watching. And if you weren't watching and saw that nobody passed, then we have to worry that somebody did. Okay. So either it's not a time factor, which is strange to say it's not a time factor. Some people say it's the amount of time that someone would stand and check that nobody's coming and that it is a time issue. Not that nobody passed, but that nobody was hanging out there. Rebbe Omer, it's the amount of time it takes to write a new get. Rabbi Yitzchak Omer, the amount of time it takes to read a get. These are connected, but not really specifically for it's a time that's measured in relating to this topic, but not necessarily that's the amount of time where something could have transpired, like option number one. So we have to write a get, to read a get, or to write and read the get, which is obviously a bit of a longer time. And even if it was there for a long time, if you have simanim, you can basically get it back based on those unique identifying features. For example, the type of siman that we call a siman muvhak, which is it has a hole specifically next to this letter. But you can't use simanim about the body of the document. For example, the amre aroch v'gutz. You can't say, oh, it was a particularly long get, or it was a particularly short get. That's not a good enough siman. If you find it wrapped in a little satchel, or a wallet, or a ring, or you found it, Rashi says, in between your stuff in your house, as it was in your kitchen cabinet or something. Even if a lot of time passed, it's valid. Okay, so we have, again, just to go over now, you have different definitions. What does immediate mean? By the way, this might remind you of the first Mishna in Masechet Brachot, the first Gemara and the Mishna, and all the braita we saw about defining time in events, right? This is very common in the time of the Gemara, where they define, nowadays we'd say 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes. We wouldn't say it like this. In those days, they defined it by actions. And often the actions are connected to the event, right? Even in Brachot, it was somewhat similar. It was when they go to eat, and we're talking about the Kohanim going to eat, when they prepare their food and how long it takes, and when they cook their food, or where there's a poor person who just eats his bread and all that. But there are time things that relate often, not always, but that relate to the event itself. Here, for sure, you see that. And they're just giving different time frames for what immediate is. So quick review of our daf. We started with the Mishna, where it seems to say only if it's immediate, otherwise you have to worry about a flip, let's switch with someone else's. Then we brought up other issues about in the braita and the Mishna, which contradicted, where there we're also worried about that maybe the person never even gave it, but that seems to be the only concern, and we're not really concerned that it got switched with somebody else's. And then we resolved both contradictions again in the same way, other than Raba who added, and we have Rabbi Zeira, whether he added it or not, that we've reviewed a few times already. Then we have Rabbi Zeira and Rabbi Yirmia and Rav Ashi, who each explained the Mishna and the braita, the Mishna Bava Metzia and the braita as a unique case. Either there was a clear sign, or the Adim said this is the only get we signed, and their names matched the Adim, and the names matched the people, and therefore it was very clear. But if it wasn't clear, then we go back to the basic law of our Mishna that no, only if it's immediate. And then we had to figure out, right? We talked about Rav Ashi is saying simanim wasn't sure if they're doraita or Rabbanit, and that's why he required a siman muvhak. And then we got into what is la'alter and all different definitions. And then from there, we also got to the issue of simanim. And if it did have a siman, then la'alter is not an issue. It doesn't have to be immediate. But what kind of simanim are good and what kind of simanim aren't good? We had a little bit of a discussion of that at the end of the daf. That's it for today. Wishing everybody a great day.